So from Shunde, China, the next stop on our global tour is Boston, Massachusetts, where we'll meet another great speaker, hear another provocative point of view on designing for the unimagined. Our next keynote speaker is Millar Millar Fisher. She's a curator of contemporary decorative arts at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Her work focuses on the interactions of people, power, and the material world. Michelle's actually currently working on her next book, Craft Schools, where we make what we inherit, and also a program series called Designing Motherhood, Things That Make and Break Our Births. We'll see some of that in her presentation, I hope. I loved hearing about it. So please join me in welcoming Millar Millar to the stage.
Thanks so much, Surya, and thank you so much, everyone at WDO, for having me. I'm going to share my screen just now, and you should let me know if you can't see what's on the screen or can't hear me at any point in time. So, hi, as Surya said, I'm Millar Millar Fisher, and I'm very, very happy to be here today. I'm a historian and a curator, and so I write and make exhibitions about how people communicate stories and invent new paradigms through designing objects and systems, and through doing so, how they change other people and the worlds around them. So in short, my job a lot of the time is to work with artists and designers to engage people in conversations about how art and design changes their lives, and how their own experiences can reshape the worlds that we all live in today. Back in 2019, I was working at the Philadelphia Museum of Art as a curator, just like the job I do now at the MFA in Boston. And I was making an exhibition called Designs for Different Futures. It was a really big project. Lots of people collaborated to make it. And the premise of this exhibition looked at design for the unimagined, just like this conference. And so the big idea of the exhibition was that our understanding and knowledge of possible futures is constantly transforming. And design, as the process through which we plan and imagine our shared futures, is crucial to helping us negotiate this very dynamic state. We had about 180,000 visitors come to the exhibition, the vast majority of whom were not in any way affiliated with design professionally. And it really was an exhibition that dug into the idea that throughout human history, we've always envisioned possible futures for ourselves and for others. And really, the lens we took was talking about how designers and architects, so all of you here today, do so as part of your daily jobs. And by doing that, you all enable almost everybody else around you to grapple with issues both large and small. And though the world often expects designers, so you, to offer solutions, in truth, your work often raises as many questions as answers. This was particularly true of the work of Scottish artist Katie Patterson, who created what she called the Future Library in 2014, and this was part of the exhibition. The Future Library is a time-based public art project that depends on our human capacity to trust and hope as we plan for the future. She conceived the project when she planted a forest of 1,000 spruce saplings outside Oslo in 2014. In 100 years, these trees will be felled to produce enough paper to print 100 books written over the century, one per year, by 100 different authors, some of whom she'll commission during her own lifetime. And when she's gone, she has set up a committee to continue the work that will replenish its members over time. So until 2114, the only things known about each manuscript will be the title and the author's name, beginning with a book by Margaret Atwood that she sent to the vault in 2014. And you see Margaret Atwood just here handing over her book. So Atwood said, "I'm sending a manuscript into time. Will any human beings be waiting there to receive it? Will there be a Norway? Will there be a forest? Will there be a library?" It's a case of writing into the void, into the completely unimagined. And this is what we had in the exhibition, because of course, so much of this project doesn't exist in ways that we can show it in the museum. So this certificate here is what we bought. It's part of the Philadelphia Museum of Art's collection. And it means that in 100 years from now, the 100 books in this project will be sent to the Philadelphia Museum and they'll become part of the museum's collection. So when we researched for the exhibition, visions of the future were as varied as the people articulating them. There's no single future waiting to unfold, and so we always kept futures plural right the way throughout the exhibition. Some of the visions that we showed will come to fruition, while others will remain dreams or threats. And so that was the part that really got me interested. Which futures remain unimagined and why? The first sentence that people encountered as they came into the exhibition on the intro text on the first wall was this open-ended question. It asked people to close their eyes and to think about what came to mind when they thought of futures. And we asked this because everyone has a different perspective. No one imagines exactly the same future. So actually, here's where it gets really interesting, to me at least. The unimaginable part for visitors wasn't the future. Visitors had loads and loads of ideas about what might come next after they opened their eyes and shared what they'd been thinking about. The unimaginable part was knowing what others had imagined. There were certainly some similarities in the answers that some visitors gave, so space travel, immortality, all the good tropes of sci-fi, world peace, but even the details of these answers were different and deeply personal more often than they were similar. Shaped by lots of different life experiences, we can't ever really truly imagine outside of ourselves. That old adage of walking a mile in somebody else's shoes, that was the unimaginable part. You can walk alongside, but never in somebody else's experience. So while you can imagine futures that pertain to your own life experience and social location, it's hard to adequately imagine a future for somebody else. So I want to share a few examples of works from this Design Futures show that help us surface that tension about what remains unimagined because it's beyond our own experiences right now, not just like Katie's work, something beyond our own lifetimes. It's this type of design work that I like to seek out as a curator because it helps me highlight not just the expansiveness of human imagination as it's expressed through design today, and that is very definitely vast, but also its limits and how, when, or even better, before we reach our limits as individuals and organizations, we might listen to others who have different experiences than our own. Research backs this approach up, actually, the worth of seeing diverse information. Columbia Business School professor Dr. Ashley Carter, somebody I've been lucky enough to learn from directly, notes that surfacing unique information as part of decision-making helps us make richer, more effective, and more equitable decisions. This type of design helps us honor multiple perspectives and experiences, and I think expands what design can be and do. So let me give you a few examples, and then I'll come back to deepen this idea a little. The 100 works in the Designs for Different Futures exhibition range tremendously in scope, in size, in material. They often designed for the unimagined, not by trying to pinpoint something really far away on the horizon, but by contending with what is happening in our lives right now, revealing today's opportunities and imbalances, and involving people directly by giving us tools to move towards what may come next. And the designers came from all walks of life. One of the more controversial items in the exhibition was the Ouroboros steak. And the work asked some really interesting questions. What might foods look and taste like, and what might our microbiomes, bodies, and environments do in different futures? And this is a question, as I think some of the other presentations have actually touched upon, that is really inhabiting people's minds. This project did something very different, though, from almost any other project that I've seen of its type over the last 10 years. So it was designer Orkan Telhan working with scientist Andrew Pelling and mycelium or mushroom fungus designer Grace Knight. And they created a meal kit with biopsy tools, a serum, a cookbook, advertising materials, and they set it up in what you see on the lower left-hand corner here as this kind of focused diner booth mise en scène. The project was named after the Ouroboros, so the circular snake swallowing its own tail as a symbol of infinity. And the Ourochef project had one very particular product. It was a meat produced from one's own human cells, grown in human serum, that is unusable blood bank byproduct. So much like contemporary home-delivered meal plans, the kit allows people to cultivate their own cells, their own human body cells, at home in a countertop incubator after isolating them with a self-biopsy. So it ensures fully informed consent, which is not possible with animal meat. The designers saw this as a solution to producing truly animal-free and ethically cultured meat. Those with carnivorous appetites should look to their own bodies as the most sustainable solution. It uses existing science and technology within the field of cellular agriculture, a term that describes the varied processes of cultivating cells, either animal or plant, in a lab setting. And so Orkan and his collaborators cultivated human cells for this project, and that's what was on display at the museum. So that's what you see just here as well in the picture. Some suggest that lab-grown meat may have less environmental impact than current resource-intensive methods of raising animals. However, producing animal cells in a lab requires large amounts of fetal bovine serum, or FBS, which is produced by aborting and killing fetal calves and extracting, purifying, and using their blood. It was what I called as a project a sleeper hit. It took until close to the end of the exhibition for the Daily Mail to run their very specialty brand of factually inaccurate and very wildly sensational reporting on it. But it really drove home the idea that given cultured lab meat doesn't necessarily take fewer resources, just different ones, and it still necessitates that animals have to be raised and killed to produce the FBS with which to engineer synthetic meat, the human cell aura burger is deliberately provocative. It's obviously created less with the intention of real mass market success, but instead the goal of asking food consumers to consider critically how new foods are sold to them and what their own responsibilities are in the ethics of the global food chain. So if we take this design back to the crux of what we can't imagine because it's beyond our own experience, so that design for the unimagined, Orkan and his co-designers want us to consider interspecies empathy and consent. We might recoil at eating ourselves or other humans, but we might have less resistance to eating animals because we can't imagine their pain or don't imagine that we need their consent to eat them in the same way that we can imagine human pain or can imagine the need for human consent. And full disclosure, I eat meat, so this is not a campaign to make you vegan. Design for the unimagined is often, like this project, speculative, and speculative design is fairly open to critique because it doesn't offer concrete solutions to pressing problems, instead preferring to provoke questions. But sometimes speculative design does inadvertently solve, and I use air quotes here, things by erasing them. The open-ended and provocative questions are not always as open-ended as they seem. This was really evident in the Design Futures research when it came to design for people with disabilities, and one conversation in particular stuck out to me. I interviewed model and activist Gillian Mercado, who you see here, and disabilities scholar Amy Hamrai for the Design Futures book. And I asked them why, when designers speculate on different futures and design for the unimagined, they often forget to think inclusively and holistically. Amy pointed to her colleague Alison Kafer's brilliant book, Feminist Queer Crip, written about a decade ago. And in it, Kafer analyzes some works of speculative fiction, books that write in different ways about worlds not yet imagined. Both Kafer and Hamrai point out that in the vast majority of these books, even when writers imagine truly spectacular new ways of living, they completely omit disability, or worse, they employ eugenicist principles of elimination of disability. Ace Ratcliffe uses the paradigm of architecture in sci-fi, one of the classic ways in which humans have designed for the unimagined. And she says, why the hell are there so many staircases in space? The inside of the TARDIS is littered with steps. You'd think that a spaceship that is regularly redecorated could easily imagine ramps in at least one iteration. The blatant issue of real-world inaccessibility leads to the scarcity of disabled writers, actors, directors, and producers that's illustrated in inaccessible spaceships and stories that severely lack in disability diversity. And I'll also quote Amy Hamrai directly here, talking about disability in our Design Futures catalog. When we only think about disability medically, then we always think that medicine is going to eliminate disabled people from the future because we have faith in cure and rehabilitation. If instead we listen to disabled people and think about the way they are surviving apocalypses that are happening in the present, then we have a different view of the future. It's individual imagination, but also the ideology that we take from medicine rather than from disability culture that shapes the ways we think about the future as having disability or not having disability. These two ideas are really critical to take on board when we think about design for the unimagined. Who designs for the unimagined? Because when we think about who gets to exercise their imagination as designers, to think about what comes next for us all, that gets to the crux of really figuring out what unimagined means, who it's defined for and by. I would contend that I think most futures have actually been imagined by somebody before. And if they seem unimagined, it might just be that we haven't been listening hard enough to those who have experienced realities different than our own. For as long as they have existed, and this is taking us to one more example from the Design Futures exhibition, for as long as they've existed, nude tights, makeup foundations, and underwear, among other examples in the garments and accessories so-called skin color pantheon, have been a cipher for a white skin tone. The Fenty Beauty line was a personal favorite of mine in the Design Futures show. Rihanna launched her Fenty line in 2017 across 15 countries, and it grossed over $72 million in its first 4 weeks. One of the products in this line, the Pro Filter Longwear Foundation, was lauded by industry insiders and customers alike for offering a groundbreaking choice with 40 different pigment tones, which was way, way more than any other cosmetics range at the time. We put them all on display in our exhibition. You see them just here, and audiences really loved it. By offering so many options, those using the foundation as a beauty aid could match the individual tone of their skin color much more precisely, and the range has since expanded to include 10 more options, bringing it to 50 total. So we can read Rihanna's design in a few ways. Told one way, it's the story of someone finally imagining a product that hadn't been available up until now and bringing it to market to serve a broader audience than the cosmetic industry had traditionally served. That's a story for design for the unimagined that's empowering, but it also glosses over another way to tell this story that might go something like this. The cosmetics industry had, for decades, ignored consumers with tens of millions of dollars of spending power because it did not invite to the table as designers or decision makers those who could see what to design to serve this demographic. This telling of the story acknowledges that it took a woman of color until 2017 to amass enough money and public attention, the precious resources needed to begin a cosmetics venture, to market a design that was far from unimagined, because let's face it, people have been cobbling together foundations to suit their skin tones for as long as foundation has been around. The first interpretation is told from the dominant position of design history as one run by a too homogeneous set of folks where it's entirely possible that no one imagined we might need more than a few shades of foundation. The second interpretation is told from the position that it often takes people who have been historically marginalized a lot longer to get their needs designed for, not because the solutions are unimaginable, but because these designs don't serve those who hold power. Those who have been historically marginalized are also less likely to have resources, be that time, wage, health, or other forms of wealth, adding extra barriers between them and their right to an imagination that can be realized in the world. I want to close with another project that I was working on at exactly the same time I was doing the Design for Different Futures show. Back in 2019, I was also working on an exhibition and a book project outside of museum hours, and it was called Designing Motherhood, Things That Make and Break Our Births. It looked at design for the arc of human reproduction. And I had to work on it outside of my day job because every museum I've ever worked for, and I've worked for a few at this point in time, declined to put it in their institution. Every member of the team who's worked on this project has a different object that is their entryway into it. But for me, it was this object, and it's another really perfect encapsulation of designing something for the unimagined. Early mechanical breast pumps were cumbersome, loud, and fairly painful for lactating people. Einar Egnell was a Swedish civil engineer, and he was one of the first to design a breast pump by specifically observing human anatomy rather than bovine subjects, or in plain English, cows, after his friend, a gynecologist, challenged him to improve upon existing technologies in the mid-1950s. So what you see here is the resulting Egnell SMB breast pump of 1956. The SMB part is for Sister Maya Kinberg's breast pump, and Sister Maya Kinberg was the nurse who collaborated on its testing in concert with new mothers in Stockholm's maternity hospital. It was portable, so it could come to lactating people rather than them having to come to it. And it didn't sound like you were feeding your breast into a meat grinder, which is always a plus for putting a design user at ease. It wasn't that design for lactation was unimagined. Innovation had been low in the sector, but pump designs had existed, and mechanical pump designs had existed for well over a century. The unimaginable part I found out was considering these designs part of the canon of design history at all. I wrote what I thought was an airtight rationale for adding it to the ranks of machine art, for humble masterpieces, and the contemporary innovations in design talking about this type of topic, and I tried to get it into a museum collection. Alongside my design collaborator, Amber Wornick, I was told that there was no audience for it. That definitely wasn't true because we started an Instagram instead, and it has thousands of followers who are actively engaged. When we published a book last year as part of the project, the first printing sold out in a few weeks. In The New Yorker in 2018, writer Jessica Winter has pointed out that the design field has historically made the mistake of ignoring the breast pump and other designs like it. And she says, what's both surprising and incalculable is just how much money design's kingmakers are leaving on the table by shunning women and mothers and babies. Breast pumps make up a $700 million market with ample room to grow. Design for birth is universally relevant because we were all born. But when we talk about our Designing Motherhood project, it often hits the limits of others' imaginations. It's seen as, and I'm quoting here some of the responses that we've had from museum directors and publishers, a women's issue or a niche idea or something that has no clearly defined audience. It's safe to say that 100% of the people that we were asking to recognize this history and greenlight our project as a book or an exhibition had never lactated, had never been denied access to reproductive services, or were not primary caregivers. For years, we were told that we were beating a dead horse trying to get public recognition for design histories that dealt with reproduction, birth, pregnancy, and the postpartum period. And it's a longer story than I have time to share today, but the crux of it goes back to the same theme that I started with. I think this resistance to the project came from the limits of imagination in the people we had to ask for space, for funding, for all of the resources to platform this design history. And it's the same story for so many of the designers of the objects and systems in the Designing Motherhood project itself. In the book, we shared the story of Meg Crane, who in the late 1960s, as a young graphic designer, because it was a designer who designed the first at-home pregnancy test, she was a young graphic designer at the global pharmaceutical company Organon. She wondered why the urine tests she saw that were used in the labs that were connected to her offices to determine pregnancy status were not available for women to use at home. So she'd wandered through the labs next to her offices, seen a line of test tubes with urine. A colleague of hers had told her those are pregnancy tests that will be sent back to doctors' offices. And that's how people learned how they were or were not pregnant at mid-century. So she used her skills in packaging design to bring the first at-home pregnancy test to market in Canada and the UK in 1971. This is what it looked like. It's now in the Smithsonian's design collection. She'd been told by her supervisors that it would be unimaginable that women could be trusted to determine their own pregnancy status without a doctor all by themselves at home. It's a good thing she didn't listen. Because while design for the unimagined can point to either an exciting futurescape or shared anxieties we have as a society, it can also indicate a lack of inclusion or imagination, the reality that none of us have the capacity to put ourselves perfectly in somebody else's shoes. It isn't that people haven't already imagined objects and systems that make the experiences of reproductive labor better. In my home country of Scotland, we have free healthcare at the point of service, unlike here in the US. In the Netherlands, there's free postpartum care. Most countries around the world, apart from the United States, have some form of paid family leave. In the end, Amber and I partnered with an amazing 40-year-old organization in Philadelphia called Maternity Care Coalition to co-realize the Designing Motherhood project. So these amazing people that you see here, lactation consultants, doulas, early childhood education specialists, they've been designing direct services for 4 decades to help people through this reproductive arc, even though they've been consistently undervalued and underfunded in their work. Together, we created 2 exhibitions that are currently in Philadelphia and will go on tour, and we hit the headlines in major newspapers. So often, design for the unimagined is choosing what and who to focus attention on, what to resource and to pool efforts around. And so to do this both effectively and equitably, we must seek out a diverse set of experiences and empower a wider range of folks as designers. As my colleague on the Designing Motherhood project says, city planner Gabriella Nelson, she says often, people are the experts of their own lives and they should be the designers of them. William Gibson is credited with saying that the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. And Dr. Ashley Carter's research that I mentioned earlier in the presentation proves that our attention is unevenly distributed too. And we need to do more to surface and listen to pieces of unique information out there. People can imagine what they need because their struggles and achievements are not abstract to them. While they may be unknown to others, they are definitely not unimagined. We must listen to them, resource them, and welcome them into the world of design. Thanks so much.
Wow. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for making us uncomfortable. I mean, I think it was in a good way, in the best way. Your provocative presentation really points to some of the implicit assumptions that surround design. Assumptions around power, around consent, around exclusion. And so I think that was absolutely wonderful. And I think what I take away from your presentation, one of the things is not to look away, right? And not to look away from, as your first slide said, that even if it makes us uncomfortable to think about it, that design can have violence baked in if we are not careful in what we do, right? The other thing that I found really fascinating was in this challenge that you're posing about the assumptions we have. You know, for me, it even brings up some questions of some of the assumptions of our process. I'm a modernist, and so in the modernist ethos, you approach a problem, and by following constraints and following the shapes, you end up at the perfect result, the intended future. Mm-hmm. But you're challenging that when you say there is not a single future. In fact, the futures fork in different directions. So thank you for these very powerful constructs. It's such a wonderful talk.
Thank you for having me, Surya. Thank you, WDO.